In this part 2 of the introduction to my What is the Samaritan Woman Story series, I'll include some of the basic questions from part 1 of this series introduction, as well as some deeper questions. Rather than taking on the role of solely a cultural Christian, asking questions as I did in the previous video, I'll ask questions based on my current level of study of this story. Let's get to my next set of questions. Why were the Pharisees keeping track of disciple counts? Who told the Pharisees that Jesus was baptizing more than John? Were John and Jesus in competition? Did the Pharisees prefer Jesus over John? If so, why? If not, why does this notion seem to be inferred? How did Jesus come to know what the Pharisees had heard? Does the word learned imply Jesus had informants inside Pharisaic circles? Could Nicodemus be the one who informed Jesus? Why do some English translations of this verse have Jesus knew rather than Jesus learned? What does learning rather than knowing suggest about Jesus' divine status? Were Jesus and John leading separate movements rather than one merging into the other? Was the Pharisees' intelligence gathering based on spying or just religious gossip? Does this verse subtly expose a spy network or flow of information between factions? If Jesus had not learned what the Pharisees had heard, would he have remained unaware and stayed in Judea? Why does the writer insert this baptism correction here in John chapter 4, verse 2? Why does this verse directly contradict John chapter 3, verse 22 and John chapter 3, verse 26? Does this parenthetical insertion indicate the Pharisees had faulty information? Was someone accusing Jesus personally of baptizing? If so, why would this be a point of contention? Does this hint that Jesus was managing a movement with operational roles? Was this detail added to protect Jesus from criticism? If so, what criticism would he have endured? Who spread the idea that Jesus was baptizing directly? What does this suggest about the authority structure between Jesus and his disciples? Why did Jesus leave Judea after the Pharisees heard about his baptizing success? Was this departure voluntary or strategic? What information provided in John chapters 1 through John chapters 3 would indicate Jesus was pressured by the Pharisees to leave? Was Jesus reassigned to Galilee by his own team or outside influence? Did the Pharisees' awareness trigger a change in mission? Was pressure applied from the other groups as well? Why does the verse indicate that he had to go through Samaria? Were there other routes? Was this necessity geographical, political, or strategic? Was this route the path of least resistance, or were there easier routes to follow? Could this indicate a planned meeting in Samaria? Is this line a signal that something covert or important is about to happen? Was this an order from someone else? Why does the story note the name of the town, Sychar? Why is it tied to Jacob and Joseph? What is the symbolic or strategic significance of this specified location? Is the mention of Jacob and Joseph meant to legitimize Jesus' presence? Was Sychar chosen for historical or operational reasons? Does the name Sychar have a deeper linguistic meaning worth exploring? What does the SKR or SCHR consonantal root suggest? Why emphasize Jesus' fatigue? Could this meeting have taken place on the Sabbath day? Why specify the time as noon? What is the significance of this time of day? Is the well merely a meeting place or something more symbolic? What meetings typically occurred at wells? Was this meeting planned for noon to ensure privacy? Why is Jesus alone at this critical moment? Why does she arrive at this unusual time to draw water? Why is this verse worded, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" rather than Jesus asked her for a drink? Why didn't Jesus ask her name? Why does the Samaritan woman remain nameless throughout the entire story? Was this a chance meeting, or were both expecting to see each other? Why does Jesus initiate contact despite social, gender, and religious boundaries? Is "give me a drink" a literal request or the first step in a verification protocol? Why does the author interrupt here to tell us Jesus' disciples left? Why weren't we made aware his disciples were with him in John chapter 4, verse 3? Like the Samaritan woman, why do the disciples remain nameless in the story? Is this setting up a dramatic or symbolic moment? How does Jesus being alone affect the tone or tension of this encounter? Why mention the reason why the disciples left? Does buying food symbolize something more? Were the disciples sent away intentionally to create privacy? Would the Samaritan woman have seen Jesus and his disciples go to the well? Would the Samaritan woman have known that one of their party had stayed behind at the well? How did she recognize Jesus as a Jew? Does she seem timid in her response? Does her response indicate she is surprised by his presence at the well? Why does she immediately name the ethnic and religious division? Is she suspicious, cautious, or signaling awareness of deeper implications? Is this her challenge or her part in the authentication process? If social norms prohibit she and Jesus from interacting, why doesn't she leave? Why does the narrator feel the need to explain Jewish-Samaritan relations to the reader? Why do some translations note the parenthetical insertion could have read, "For Jews do not use the dishes of Samaritans"? What is the gift of God he refers to? Is living water symbolic, metaphorical, or a code word? Does living water have a real-world definition known to the people of that time? Is this a hint that the roles are being reversed, and that she is the one in need and not him? Why use hypothetical language if you knew? Is he testing her understanding or readiness? Is this the next level of the authentication process? Is she playing along, or is she genuinely confused? Does nothing to draw with hint at a surface-level misunderstanding or a deliberate double meaning? Is she testing his response or challenging his credibility? Is "where can you get" a literal question or a deeper probe? Is there a contrast being made between a deep well and living water? Is there a parallel between the Samaritan woman being nameless and Jesus remaining nameless to the Samaritan woman? Why invoke Jacob here? Is the "Our Father Jacob" only referring to Samaritans, or is this phrase also inclusive of Jesus and the Jews? What power or authority does the name Jacob hold? Is she asking about Jesus' legitimacy or his right to speak on spiritual, ethnic, or political matters? Is she suggesting he must prove himself? Does this verse mark a turning point from suspicion to curiosity? Is there a parallel being drawn between Jesus and Jacob? Does Jesus disparage the well water here? Who is everyone who drinks this water? What is eternal life in this context? Heaven, survival, or something else? Is this promise metaphorical or mission-oriented? Is Jesus using layered language to convey multiple meanings at once? Could spring of water imply continual renewal or even initiation into something? Is Jesus using a play on words by describing a spring of water which wells up? Is she being sincere or sarcastic? Does her response reflect belief or baiting? Does John chapter 4 verse 15 parallel John chapter 6 verse 34 in some way? Why mention avoiding the well? Does she associate the well with shame, labor, exposure, or dwindling resources? Presuming this is a planned meeting, is this a literal request, or has Jesus passed the authentication protocol? Why does Jesus suddenly shift the conversation to her husband? Is this part of Jesus' testing of her, or part of Jesus' continued verification process? Could husband have symbolic meanings such as tribal leader or regional authority? Is he asking this to expose a secret or test her honesty? If Jesus already knows she doesn't have a legitimate husband, what does this intelligence leak signal to her? Is her answer defensive, truthful, or carefully phrased? Why does Jesus affirm her statement, and what does that accomplish rhetorically? Is this part of a mutual recognition moment? Could husband still refer to something metaphorical like national or religious affiliation? What does her answer signal in terms of readiness for further revelation? Why are the number and status of her relationships important to this narrative? Are the 5 husbands symbolic of past political, theological, or regional alliances? The total number of women's past relationships is 6. Does this number parallel other quantities in this gospel? Who or what is the current man she has? Why does Jesus commend her for her honesty? Is this relation meant to shock, shame, or recruit? What does the marital status information dump indicate to the Samaritan woman about Jesus and his authority? What about the marital status discussion cause her to identify him as a prophet? Why doesn't she think he's the Messiah at this point? What further information does she need in order to label him the Messiah? Is she acknowledging his access to hidden information? Does this label place Jesus within a known category she can work with? Is this the beginning of her shift from skepticism to belief or recognition? Is calling him a prophet a cautious political move anticipating higher-ranking negotiations? Why shift the topic to worship locations? Is she deflecting, challenging the subject, or testing Jesus' alignment? Is this mountain Mount Gerizim, and why does it matter here? Is this a theological question or a territorial one? Could this be a coded way of asking, whose side are you on? Is this the first step in a negotiation between Jews and Samaritans? Why does Jesus label her woman, given they both know she's a woman? What does a time is coming indicate about this conversation's moment in time? Why does Jesus reject both Mount Gerizim and Jerusalem as worship sites? Is this an eschatological statement or a political one? Who is included in you? Is it her personally or the Samaritans collectively? What does it mean for worship to be disconnected from place? Is this foreshadowing a revolution, a new movement, or a decentralization of power? How would decentralized worship benefit Jews and Samaritans? Why does Jesus draw a line between Samaritan and Jewish knowledge? Is this a rebuke, a clarification, or a strategic admission? What does salvation is from the Jews mean from a genealogical, geographical, or theological standpoint? Does this imply the Jews are the custodians of a system now expanding? If so, which Jewish sects are the rightful custodians? Is Jesus aligning with Judean authority here or undercutting it? What are the differences in worship practices between the Jews and the Samaritans? What does it mean that a time is coming and has now come within the context of this conversation? Who are the true worshipers and what qualifies them? Is the Spirit and truth a coded phrase for something practical like courage and loyalty? What is the Father seeking exactly in his worship? Is it obedience, awareness, action? Does this verse signal a redefinition of religious legitimacy? What does it mean that God is spirit? Is this ontology, metaphor, or revolutionary redefinition? Is Jesus equating proper worship with inner disposition rather than ritual or place? How would this idea challenge both Samaritan and Jewish traditions? Does this verse redefine what it means to be a follower? Does worship really mean worship, as we've come to know it in this verse? What about the God, the Spirit, worship, and truth discourse made the title Messiah come to the Samaritan woman's mind? Where did she get her understanding of a coming Messiah? What kind of Messiah does she expect? Does she expect a teacher, ruler, or liberator? Why does she focus on explaining everything? Is this a veiled request for Jesus to reveal himself? Could this be a test, or does she already suspect who he is? Why does Jesus reveal his identity here and not elsewhere? Is this a private revelation or a strategically placed announcement? What weight does I am he carry in a Jewish or Samaritan context? Is this the climax of a pre-planned authentication dialogue? Was the woman expecting to meet with an emissary or a prophet, but not the Messiah himself? What is the woman supposed to do with this information? Why are the disciples surprised? Is it because of her gender, her ethnicity, or something deeper? What does their silence suggest? Was it respect, confusion, or fear of interrupting? Were they trained not to question certain interactions? Did they sense this meeting had special significance? Why include their inner thoughts if they were never voiced? Why did they arrive at this very moment in the story? What dramatic effect could the timing of their return have accomplished in this story? Why does she leave her water jar? Was she shocked to be talking with the Jewish Messiah himself rather than one of his emissaries? Is leaving the water jar symbolic abandonment of her task or former life? What does she mean by the hyperbolic statement, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did"? Is she spreading news, rallying support, or fulfilling a mission? Why does she call him a man? After Jesus' admission, why does she still ask, could this be the Messiah? Is she inviting investigation from her fellow Samaritans? Why do the townspeople respond so quickly to her message if she is an outcast? What credibility does she carry with them? Were they already expecting someone? Does her report function like a public alert or call to assembly? Are they coming with curiosity, skepticism, or something else? Why do his disciples urge him to eat something right at this moment? Does this interaction parallel John chapter 6, verses 5 through 7 in some way? Are they apprehensive about the oncoming group of Samaritans? Are they unaware of the significance of what just happened? Did Jesus appear to be so famished he needed to eat right then? Does their focus on food contrast with Jesus' deeper concerns? Is this a setup for a metaphorical teaching? Why is literal food being compared to metaphorical food? Is food metaphorical throughout the story? When is food real and when is it not real in this story? Is this about spiritual fulfillment, secret knowledge, or completed mission? Does the phrase imply insider access or hidden instructions? Could this be coded language for orders received or tasks accomplished? Why do they take his words literally? Do they take his words literally? Are they being naive or purposely engaging in metaphorical speech? Is their confusion meant to contrast with the woman's insight? Could this misunderstanding be a narrative device to highlight their spiritual dullness or lack of situational awareness? Who might they suspect gave him the food he already had with him? Does Jesus' definition of food answer the question about what food actually is in this story? What is the will he refers to? Whose work is he finishing? What work has started which Jesus was finishing? Is this a military or political mission cloaked in spiritual language? Who exactly sent him? God, a group, or a movement? What is the traditional saying Jesus refers to? Who was told by the disciples, "It's still 4 months until the harvest"? Why contradict the disciples' saying by indicating the harvest is ripe now? Are the fields literal people who are ready to be gathered, recruited, or awakened? Is this a call to immediate action? Does this verse suggest a hidden calendar or a pre-planned moment? Does the harvest in 4 months mirror the phrase, "A time is coming," and the ripe for harvest phrase mirror, "A time has come"? Who is the one who reaps? Jesus, his followers, or the woman? What are the wages being drawn? Are they spiritual, political, or personal? Is eternal life a metaphor for something else such as legacy, revolution, or survival? Why highlight the unity between sower and reaper? Is this describing a strategy where groundwork and action are divided between groups? Why quote this proverb here? Who is the one and who is the other in this context? Is this pointing to a division of labor between Jesus and John the Baptist, Jesus and his disciples, or Jesus and the woman? Does this suggest multiple missions working in tandem? Is Jesus identifying himself more as a reaper or a sower? Who are the others who did the hard work? Are they John the Baptist, prophets, the Samaritans? Why are the disciples being given a mission they didn't prepare? Is this redistribution of credit or a call to humility? What kind of labor is being referenced? Is it teaching, suffering, or preparation? Why is their testimony so persuasive to the townspeople? What kind of influence or reputation did she have before this? Is "he told me everything I ever did" a literal claim or a symbolic shorthand? What does this suggest about the value of personal witness in the narrative? Are the townspeople believing in Jesus or in her belief about Jesus? Why do they invite him to stay? Was it curiosity, gratitude, or something strategic? Why does Jesus agree to stay when he earlier had to go to Galilee? What is the symbolic meaning of 2 days? Is this a mission stop, a rest, or a diplomatic stay? What happened during those 2 days that isn't recorded? What were these words that convinced them? Were his words parables, prophecy, or recruitment? Does the "many more became believers" mirror the gaining and baptizing more disciples than John earlier in the story? Are these conversations symbolic or a shift in allegiance or awareness? Did the woman's initial influence lay the groundwork for this response? Is this affirmation a dismissal of her role or a validation of it? Why do they use the phrase "Savior of the world" and not Messiah? Why don't they use the phrase "Son of God"? Does this phrase carry political, religious, or universal meaning? Are they declaring spiritual truth or swearing allegiance? What does this say about communal confirmation versus individual testimony? Does this phrase inversely parallel Jesus, the Pharisees, and John the Baptist at the beginning of the story? Why does Jesus leave precisely after 2 days? Was this a pre-planned duration or a symbolic pause? What did he accomplish in Samaria that allowed him to resume his journey? Does the number 2 relate to timing, structure, or a message progression? Is this a closure of one mission before beginning another? Why is this statement inserted here, right before his arrival in Galilee? Does this mirror other parenthetical insertions in this story? Is Galilee his own country, or is this referring to Judea? Is this setting up a contrast between Samaritan acceptance and Jewish and Galilean rejection? Was this a common proverb or personal reflection? Does this comment hint at Jesus' isolation or internal awareness of common conflict? How does this welcome align with the previous statement about the prophet's honor? What exactly did they see in Jerusalem other than the temple cleansing and the argument with the Jews concerning the temple? In the previous slides, I posed several questions both a first-time reader as well as someone familiar with the Samaritan Woman story may have. In the next sequence of videos in this series, I'll begin to provide my answers for some of those questions I've asked. I'm sure these answers will inspire more questions as we continue to ask, what is the Samaritan Woman story?